Hey, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm going to do an AP European History review for my students to be able to help them prep for the AP test. At the end of every school year, I encourage my students to use the official study guides from the College Board and use those to study all the content and concepts that they need. I know that this is quite a plain document. It's not really super exciting. So if you would rather just go and read it on your own, look up concepts on Google and do your own reading. That might be a more effective way to do these things. But there's also some people who are auditory learners. And although this will not be incredibly visually stimulating, I am going to read through this document and use some resources from the internet and maybe a little bit of visuals to try to help students to understand the concepts that I'm looking at right here. So this is AP European History, Unit 1. It focuses on two major topics, the Renaissance and exploration. I'd like to point out, of course, that the dates are highly significant, 1450 to 1648. And if somebody's a new student in an AP European history class, I think the first thing that you have to do is look at those dates and ask yourself why. Why does this class start in 1450? And why does this first time period, this first unit, end in 1648? That seems like a pretty random date. So what's going on then? Why 1648? Why not just cap it at like 1650? That's a perfect 200 years. And that really is the bulk of this class. When we're looking at this, we have to ask ourselves that why question all the time. That's what stimulates our brains. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that history is just about memorizing names and dates. And I hope that's not the experience you've had in history, because there's so much more to it. We have to ask those deep questions of why. So if we look at the date 1450 right there, all of a sudden our brain has to have certain information that happened before this 1450 date in order to help us process what's going to happen starting then. And so that's what this first topic is. If you look at this list right here, this outline, topic 1.1 says contextualizing Renaissance and discovery. And I like to point out that word contextualizing because that's one of the skills that's embedded into this course. It's one of the skills that we want you to have as a student. If we're looking at Europe and trying to understand Europe, what's happening before 1450? And it would be really important for us to understand some things about geography. First of all, this is Google Earth, and we're looking at a modern map of Europe and with all the modern boundaries. And the more geography you know about Europe, the more you'll understand the things that we're talking about. So I encourage my students to learn their geography, and honestly, not just the geography of Europe, but the geography of the world. There's no way to separate geography and history. So just wanted to point that out and make sure it was clear what we're talking about. I'll be using Google Earth to show you some places that we're talking about. But that word contextualization, I like to think of the word contextualization. We've all watched, say, Netflix before and binged watched something. And these programs that are serial in nature that we binge watch on Netflix, a lot of times they'll start off the program by saying something to the effect of previously on, right? And then they recap, 30 seconds of what happened before, so that if it's been a while in between programs, you can remember important stuff that's happened previously in the program. That way you understand what happens in the episode you're watching currently. So if you ever see that word context, context is everything. If we say something and it's not in the proper context, then we truly don't understand what's being said. If I was to use the example, a historical example, and I was to say something like, hey, my grandpa killed a man, you might think, whoa, dude, your grandpa's a horrible person. That's horrible. But then if I add a little bit of context to it and I say, well, he killed he killed several people on June 6th, 1944. Now, that date might not mean anything to you, but if I add a little bit of context and I say this happened on the beaches of Normandy, which is located right about here by Cannes and Le Havre, this area right up in here is where Normandy is. And in June 6th, 1944, Allied forces from Great Britain, the United States, and Canada launched what historians like to call D-Day, and that was to liberate occupied France from the Nazi occupation during World War II. And so, if my grandpa killed a lot of people on June 6th, 1944, and then you start to understand the where and the when and some of the information behind that, then you start to understand that context is everything. And so, each of these units in the these AP study guides are going to start off with contextualization, and that's a skill we want our students to learn. So what I like about these documents and these outlines that I'm going to use is it's going to highlight the learning objective underneath each one of the topics. And this first learning objective is to explain the context in which the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery developed. And so right off the bat, your brain, if you were an AP history student, your brain would automatically want to go to things like the medieval times. The time period right before the time period right before the Renaissance is usually called the Middle Ages, sometimes called the Dark Ages or the medieval times. And that's what's going on in Europe right before the Renaissance and this age of discovery. If you go even further back, before what we like to call, the Middle Ages, then you'd get into like the Roman times. And if you go even before the Roman times, then you get into the time period in European history when it's dominated by the Greeks, the Hellenistic world, as some people like to refer to it. And so as you can see this bullet point right here, I'm going to read through this, but I'll also stop and make comments as needed, and maybe even go over to Google and pull up some visual aids, some maps and charts and things like that as needed. And if you'll bear with me on that, it might be helpful. Again, at any time, if you're like, dude, I could read this so much quicker, you're spending so much time on small and insignificant things, then please stop this video, go read it for yourself. That's awesome. What I'm trying to do is take this document and bring it to life. So bullet point, the first bullet point right here under Learning Objective A says, the rediscovery of works from ancient Greece and Rome and observation of the natural world changed many Europeans' views of their world. So that's a huge thematic concept, a key concept that every AP European history student needs to know. That when people near the end of the Middle Ages started to read works from antiquity, the ancient Greek and Roman authors, and look at ancient Greek and Roman architecture or Greek and Roman art, it started to shape how they saw their world. It started to change things. And these smaller bullet points right here, a revival of classic texts led to new methods of scholarship and new values in both society and religion. And I like to point that out because what we're going to do, what some of the things that the AP test is going to focus on is social changes, how events and things change socially. Also, we're going to spend a whole bunch of time talking about the religious impact that happens from 1450 to 1648 on another review. I'd like to point that again, this is just a review for Unit 1, Renaissance and Exploration. There are other topics that happen between 1450 and 1648, but those will be covered on different reviews. The second bullet point says, the visual arts incorporated the new ideas of the Renaissance and were used to promote personal, political, and religious goals. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. So one of the things that we're going to talk about is that Europeans had a certain way of doing things, had certain cultural norms, and as they go out and they start to explore other places, they're going to come into contact with other populations, especially indigenous ones. And it's going to be catastrophic for some. There's going to be this interrelation, this intermarriage of culture and ideas that goes back and forth. And so that's really important. Indigenous populations, like if you go, let's just say you went to, say, the Americas. What were some of the indigenous populations that were happening in the Americas? Well, if you come up here to like a place like Mexico, you'd find the Aztec civilization. When the Spanish showed up in like central Mexico area, where you'd find modern day Mexico City, you'd find giant pyramids as big as the pyramids that you might find over in, say, like Giza in Egypt. Giant, huge pyramids. So the Aztec civilization was powerful. A lot of people are also familiar with what we might call the Mayan civilization in the Yucatan Peninsula and even down here into Central America. If you were to go to places like Guatemala, Belize, even as far down as like El Salvador and into the southern parts of Mexico, especially on that Yucatan Peninsula, you find all kinds of Mayan ruins there. So these would be some of the indigenous populations. If you go further down to, say, like South America, in the Andes Mountains, like, say, northern Chile, southern Peru, even parts of Bolivia, you can see on this map this brown area right here. These are the Andes Mountains, the second highest chain of mountains on the planet Earth. And in that area, you'd find, of course, the ancient Incan civilization. So that's one example of indigenous populations that Europeans are going to come into conflict with and come into contact with. Throughout the entire Pacific, they're going to meet all kinds of Polynesian cultures, from the Sandwich Islands, which today is called Hawaii, to New Zealand, the Maori population. It's going to be a huge conflict and cultural clash. To French Polynesia, if you get out here in the southern Pacific Ocean. And of course, like, say, the Aborigines of Australia. So these are just some examples of indigenous populations that Europeans would come into conflict with and come into contact with as they were going out exploring. And so that's where we're at right there, these indigenous populations. I'm looking at the top of the screen right now. European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and establish colonies. So I like to teach my students that there's the three G's. There's God, gold, and glory. Those are the three things that European nations were driven by during this era of exploration. They wanted to go out and to find commercial and religious opportunities. So they wanted to go out and find gold or to make money through cash crops. And so a whole plantation system is going to develop in the Americas. And again, this is all starting around 1450. European maps at the time, of course, were incredibly unsophisticated during medieval times. At least by our modern standards. I'm looking at Google Earth and I can zoom into any city and go into a street view and 3D imagery and all these kind of things. It's pretty amazing. But back on the time that they didn't necessarily have very good maps. And there's a couple of events that are happening in 1450 that we'll be talking about. This area over here we like to call the Middle East. If you see where Turkey is, and if you see where Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel, and Egypt, this area right here, in today's world is called the Middle East. And one of the reasons it's called the Middle East is because it's in the middle of three continents. You have Africa down here to the south. You, of course, have Europe that we're focusing in on right here. And over here you have Asia, the largest continent on the planet Earth. A lot of people are like, well, how can you tell where Europe starts and where Asia starts or stops? And it looks like it's all connected by land, and that's true, it is. But where all three continents come together and you can literally walk by land through all of those continents, this is called the Middle East. And if you're not familiar with geography, if you take this lake right here, this is the Caspian Sea, a gigantic, huge lake, and you were to go from the Caspian Sea up to this chain of mountains right here, just kind of take it straight up to the Arctic Ocean up here. These mountains right here are called the Ural Mountains. And if you go from those Ural Mountains to the Caspian Sea, that's generally considered the border between Europe and Asia. And if you were to take this chain of mountains right here between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, there's a chain of mountains right here called the Caucasus. These Caucasian mountains, if you've ever filled out one of those reports where you have to like fill in your ethnicity. Sometimes people call themselves Caucasian if they're white, but these are the Caucasus Mountains, and it's kind of the dividing line here between Europe and Asia. Europe to the north, Asia to the south, and then right here from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, there is small straits right here where Istanbul is. I know you have to really zoom in and see that there is a connect. So right there you can see this water that doesn't allow the land to connect. They have bridges and such today, but there's also some other, the Dardanelles and the Bosporus Straits. So there is, actually you cannot go walk right there, you'd have to take a boat at some point. But that's where the connection between Europe and Asia actually happens. As far as Asia and Africa connecting, they do connect by land. In modern times, people have built a canal called the Suez Canal that connects the Red Sea down here, this Gulf right here of Suez, and the Mediterranean Sea, and they've built a canal called the Suez Canal. But that wasn't done until the late 1800s. So what we're talking about this time in history is there really is three different worlds right here. And collectively, this is referred to as the Old World. Europe, Africa, and Asia. This is the Old World. And they're going to come into contact with the New World, which would be the Americas, both North and South. And so that's what we're discussing right here as we get into this overseas territories. We're going to go ahead and keep reading here from this study guide. European society and the experiences of everyday life were increasingly shaped by commercial and agricultural capitalism, notwithstanding the continued existence of medieval social and economic structures. I like to point out the word capitalism. That's a word that we use in the world today, where people are willing to invest money into a program, hoping to get a return. Capitalism, of course, requires there to be competition in the marketplace. If one person controls an entire market, that's a monopoly, and that's really the opposite of what capitalism is. Capitalism is the opposite of, say, something like communism, which is a topic that will be discussed later on, where people have things in common. Okay, capitalism can be bad too because people are driven by greed, and capitalism's all about getting rich and wealthy and etc. So those are a couple of the things. And so agricultural capitalism, of course, making money through crops. And the big crops that are going to happen during this age of exploration, once the New World is discovered, one of the first crops that's going to make people rich is tobacco. And so colonies are going to be set up in the southern, what becomes the United States. Of course, back then it was just Native American territory. But in the southern states, there's going to be tobacco. Later, cotton is going to be, of course, a very valuable product. But the big one down in the Caribbean is going to be sugar. And everybody's got a sweet tooth, and it's addictive. And that's the great thing. If you're selling an addictive substance, it sucks if you're the person buying it because you're addicted. But it's great if you're the person selling it because you always get a return customer. And so when it says agricultural capitalism, those are some of the things that are going to be driving the economy. Capitalism is going to be a growing venture. People don't really use the word capitalism until, like, say, late 1700s, early 1800s is when people start to use it. But that's really the direction we're heading for this entire class. I'm going to continue to read from this topic. Economic changes produced new social patterns while traditions of hierarchy and status continued. So we still get a whole bunch of stuff from medieval times during the Renaissance. So the social structure doesn't really change that much. If you're familiar with things like The king is at the top, and he has lords and nobles and vassals underneath that. And these lords and nobles have knights that serve them. And then at the bottom, you get the peasantry or the serfs. That's the social structure that continues to perpetuate during the Renaissance time, even though things do start to change. And that's one of the things we talk about in this class, how things change. Most Europeans derive their livelihood from agriculture and oriented their lives around the seasons, the village, or the manor, although economic changes began to alter rural production and power. Again, the more you know about medieval times, the more you'll understand. And again, that's what this whole first thing is trying to establish that students have some type of a background to understand the context of what's happening in the world at 1450. And again, why does this kind of end, or what happens in 1648 that kind of closes off this first unit? And that's where we're heading. If you're not there yet, stay tuned and keep reading. We'll get to all of that. The struggle for sovereignty within and among states resulted in varying degrees of political centralization. Right there in my head, it's screaming the 100 Years' War. I know it doesn't say the 100 Years' War right there, but if I'm a student of medieval times, and I know during the 1300s, middle of the 1300s to the middle of the 1400s, there was a massively huge, long drawn-out conflict between France and England. And this 100 Years' War was really over the rights of succession to the French throne. And you might say to yourself, well, obviously the French kings have the rights to the French throne. It's not that simple. If you know anything about the history of Great Britain during medieval times, you know that there was a guy from Normandy. Again, this area here in northern France, right by this city called Caen and Le Havre and Rouen. A guy named William the Conqueror. And in 1066, this is the famous, he crosses the English Channel. If you look over here by Calais and by Dover, that's the closest place where Great Britain today and France nearly meet. But this guy from Normandy, the northern part of France, he invades England and he conquers England. And then he goes on to conquer Wales. And he's going to go on to conquer Ireland, and he is literally called William the Conqueror, and he's going to establish England as his country. But if you're paying attention, you just heard me say that he came from France. And so there is an interconnectedness throughout the entirety of the kings of France and the kings of England, that they're tied together, even though they don't like each other, and there's always this dynastic struggle between the two. That is a huge part of it. And William the Conqueror goes on. Again, the more you know your geography, the easier this is to understand. There are, in fact, 4 parts of a country today called the United Kingdom. And this happens slowly over time. There's England. You can see clearly right here in the middle. That's the lower part of the island. Then Wales is over here on the west side. Up at the north, we have Scotland up in the Highlands. And then, of course, you have North Ireland or Northern Ireland. And you can see the boundaries. The rest of this island today is an independent country, but that didn't happen until like World War I times, when Ireland got its independence. So that's what we're happening right here. We're talking about all these things. So the new concept of the sovereign state and secular system of law played a central role in the creation of new political institutions. And that is what we're talking about and we're going to get into. So in the next video, I'll cover topic 1.2. Thanks for tuning in. Again, if you would rather go at a quicker pace and look some things up on your own, please do so. This is provided as a review opportunity for students taking the AP test. Thanks for joining.